Yerushalayim Yirkoshecha Ki Adon Bal HaYeshuos Ubal HaNechamois Ki Adon Bal HaYeshuos Ubal HaNechamois Ki Adon Bal HaYeshuos Ubal HaNechamois Ve'areinu Hashem Elokeinu V'nechom Asiyon Irecho U'bebinyan Yerushalayim Yirkoshecha.
Oi! Oi, hope the sound wasn't bad during the music. Hello, everybody. How are you? It's great to be with you on a Tuesday evening. That was Ve'areinu from Rabbi Baruch Chait from his album called Salonika. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Okay. Who is with us on a Tuesday evening? Stephen in New Hampshire, James in Annapolis, Renee in Indiana, Shandora in the Bronx, Paul in the Great Northwest, David in South Bend, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Lucy in Minnesota, Franco back home and recovering. May you have a refuah shlema, Franco. Yosef in Massachusetts. Wait, it keeps skipping on me. Hold on. Paul is saying the longest day. Oh, yeah, it's the longest day. June 21st, right? First day of summer. Happy summer, everybody. And happy, what is it? The summer solstice. Must be the summer solstice. Candy in Texas. Tom says shalom. Rochelle in Florida. Guy in Ohio. Tracy in Fort Worth. And Aoife in Florida. Marjorie in Virginia. Checking in. Welcome, everybody. All right. We're going to finish chapter 12 today with God's help here in Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of levirate marriage. This chapter 12 has been all about the chalitzah ceremony, its elements. What if certain elements are left out? What if they're performed out of order? What if only one element is performed? It's definitely not a valid chalitzah, but what other implications does it have that you commenced chalitzah, as it were? We picked this up at the bottom of page 105b, and our daf today is Kuf Vav, page 106. A story is told in the Mishna about an incident in which a couple once performed chalitzah. So you're joining us for the first time. Levirate marriage is this obligation that if a man dies, leaving a widow and at least one brother, he didn't have a child while he was alive, so now the widow and the brother have an obligation to get married, and their first child becomes the heir, the inheritor of the brother who died. They don't have to get married. They can perform the alternative mitzvah of chalitzah, a ceremony which releases them from this obligation to each other, and then they're free to go marry whoever they want. So a story is told in the Mishnah about an incident in which a couple once performed chalitzah between themselves in private. We're discussing Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 12. And at the end of the Mishnah, there was this incident. The Mishnah is telling us that you know, among other things, you have to have 3 witnesses, right? We've seen that you have to have no less than 3 witnesses. You don't have to have more. 3 will suffice. Sorry. But you can't do it with less than 3, for it to be a valid chalitzah. Well, there was this incident in which a man and woman were stuck in prison. They had this levirate obligation to each other. There was no way for them to come before witnesses in order to get the chalitzah, done in the proper fashion. But I guess there were exigent circumstances. Maybe she was going to get out of the prison. She wanted to be free. Maybe this man was going to be stuck in prison forever, and this was their last chance to perform the chalitzah. Hard to know. But they did it without any witnesses present, without any judges present. And afterward, Rabbi Akiva ratified it, as we'll see. Now, the law is not with Rabbi Akiva in this regard, and yet somehow he ratified it. So let's learn more. So there was a private chalitzah performed in a prison, and it was validated. Now, did the incident in which they performed chalitzah between him and her privately actually take place outside, not in a prison, and in a different locale? And the reference to prison in the incident is not that the man and the woman were in prison, but rather that Rabbi Akiva was in prison. Rabbi Akiva in prison? Why would Rabbi Akiva be in prison? Rabbi Akiva was imprisoned, and he actually ended up dying a horrible death because of the Roman persecution. And so, at the age of 40, he started learning, and he had a very long and distinguished career as a Torah scholar, one of the biggest ever. And he eventually dies at 120 years of age. And at the very end of his life, the Romans imprisoned him because they outlawed Torah study and the public Torah teaching, let's say. And Rabbi Akiva kept teaching, so they imprisoned him, and then he died as one of these 10 martyrs that we recall at various times during the year. So Rabbi Akiva was in prison. So perhaps when they say that they were in prison, it's not that the man and the woman were in prison, but rather that Rabbi Akiva was in prison. Or perhaps the incident when they performed chalitzah between him and her did actually take place in prison, and then this case came before Rabbi Akiva. And Rav Yehuda said that Rav said this chalitzah incident took place in prison, and also the case came before Rabbi Akiva while he was in prison. So the sages taught, and that's all we're going to hear about that. So Rabbi Akiva approved it, but we don't learn a precedent from that. You can't do a private chalitzah. Maybe they had exigent circumstances and acted on it, but they're going to need to do a proper chalitzah in front of at least 3 competent people at another point. So now we go to a new subject, and now we're at the top of 106a. The sages taught a mistaken chalitzah is valid. Now the Gemara asks, what constitutes a mistaken chalitzah? And Reish Lakish said, well, it is any case in which they say to a yavam, the brother, who is not well versed in the law, let her remove your shoe, and in doing so, you will take her in marriage. I.e., the yavam understands that by allowing chalitzah, he will actually be marrying her. He's an ignoramus, right? He's an am haaretz, which is the Hebrew term for an ignoramus. He doesn't know what the law is, and they tell him, oh, let her take off your shoe, and then you'll be married to her. And they've lied to him. So he thought he was marrying her, when in fact, he was releasing her in a chalitzah ceremony, after which he can never marry her. She'll actually be prohibited to him after that. So although he actually intended to marry her, having allowed her to remove his shoe validates the chalitzah. And subsequently, it is prohibited for the woman to marry him, and she is permitted to others. So this definition of a mistaken chalitzah, according to Reish Lakish, is that he made a mistake, the yavam, based on a lie or faulty information, and his intention was actually to marry her when he allowed her to perform the ceremony that was the opposite of marriage in a sense. So Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, right? Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish were, Rabbi Yochanan was his teacher, but Reish Lakish was his brightest student and really his debate partner. And they were so for many years. And after Reish Lakish died, Rabbi Yochanan was miserable because he felt he had no one as sharp as Reish Lakish to discuss the law with. But here, Rabbi Yochanan is like, what the heck are you talking about? Rabbi Yochanan said to him, I teach that whether in a case where he had intended to perform valid chalitzah and she did not intend, or if she intended and he did not intend, the chalitzah is not valid. In other words, unless both parties are doing exactly what they intend to do in performing this chalitzah, both the man and the woman, the yavam and the yavama, have full conscious intent to perform chalitzah. And if that is lacking on either side, they didn't do anything. It is not a valid chalitzah. Unless they both intend together as one with a united purpose to perform a proper chalitzah, they haven't, and she will not be permitted to go and marry others. And yet, you, Reish Lakish, say that in that case, when he doesn't have any intention of permitting her to others, because he actually intends to marry her through this act that he thinks is a marriage act because he's an ignoramus, you say that this chalitzah is valid? How could you say that, Reish Lakish? Rather, a mistaken chalitzah is something completely different. A mistaken chalitzah that is valid refers to any case in which they say to him, to the yavam, let her perform chalitzah on you with the intention of releasing her bond on the condition that she will give you 200 dinars afterward. And then, even if she does not give him the money, the chalitzah is valid as the stipulated condition is not binding. Okay. So he has an intention to perform chalitzah. His motivation was bad. Why would this guy do this? I mean, you can see what's going on here. This is a brother-in-law who doesn't care whether he marries her or not. He really doesn't want to marry her. But he understands that she's stuck. You know, maybe her husband died. It's already been a few years. She'd like to get on with her life. She and a nice man who lives up the street have fallen in love. This guy's going to be a good father to her children. She can see that she might have had children from before the marriage where the man died. So she might already have kids. And this new guy's going to be a good father to her kids and a good husband. And she wants to get on with her life and marry him. But she can't because she still has this levered obligation to her brother-in-law. And so the brother-in-law says, I got an opportunity. I've got her over a barrel. I'll let her perform chalitzah if she pays me. And 200 dinars is a huge amount of money that they're talking about here. And otherwise, he won't let her. So he's blackmailing her. He's extorting her. So then in that case, she can say, all right, I'll pay you. So he allows the chalitzah to be performed. And then she says, I changed my mind. I'm not going to pay you. But the chalitzah is nonetheless valid. Terrible set of precedents on all sides here, but you can understand that what the court is doing is protecting her. Now, this idea of Rabbi Yochanan is also taught in a baraisa, which states a mistaken chalitzah is valid. And what constitutes a mistaken chalitzah? Any case in which they say, let her perform chalitzah with you on condition that she will give you 200 dinars. And an incident occurred involving a certain woman who came before her yavam for yibum, and yet he was not suitable for her. And the judges, said to this man, let her perform chalitzah on the condition that she will give you 200 dinars. And afterward, when she did not pay, the incident came before Rabbi Chia, and he validated that chalitzah. Right? So this case wasn't so much that the guy, the yavam, just wanted to get money from her. Rather, he wanted to marry her. He was probably playing over his head. You know what I mean? Like, she was really beautiful, really smart. He was some kind of, undesirable man in her eyes. He didn't want to let go of the idea of being able to marry such a, beautiful and accomplished woman. She absolutely did not want to be with him. Now, normally a reasonable man will say, okay, she doesn't want to marry me. I'll just let her go so she can be happy, especially my dead brother's widow. You'd think he'd be decent about it. But this guy was not willing. He was stubborn. And since he wouldn't change his mind, so they tricked him. They said that they offered a bribe. Then he allowed the chalitzah, and then they didn't want to pay the bribe, as it were. And they ratified that situation. Now, one man came before Rabbi Chia bar Abba with his yevama in order to have the court convince her to perform yibum. Right? She didn't want to perform yibum. This guy thought it really would be good for her, for the family, for everybody. So he brought her to the court to see if he could get some support from the judges. Rabbi Chia said to her, my daughter, stand up, for we are beginning to discuss your case now, and the participants must stand in a court, in a rabbinic court. So she said to him, well, say that her sitting, meaning my sitting, the woman is referring to herself in the third person here, say that her sitting, referring to her desire to remain seated as an act of refusal, of even contemplating the possibility of performing yibum with this man, is therefore tantamount to her standing. As yibum, levirate marriage, is not an option for her. right? She's indicating not only by words, but by actions that she's just not going to go along with this idea, not of her yavam and not of any supporters that he may have brought, that she should consent to marry him. So in other words, the option that will enable her to remain standing proud in the future is not to enter into yibum with this man. So Rabbi Chia said to her, "Are you acquainted with this yavam, and do you know him well enough to know why he wants to perform yibum with you, even though you are not interested?" And she said to him, "Yes, it is money that he saw in her." Right? Meaning not that she's rich and he wants the money. In any case, he's going to step into his brother's estate, although she may have brought, considerable wealth from her father's house that might not go to the yavam. In any case, here, when she says, yes, it is money that this yavam sees in me, she says her, but she means herself, this is a euphemism for herself. It's not that he literally wants money, he wants money out of this situation, but rather that he thinks I'm valuable, that he wants to be with me because he thinks that would be acquiring something of value for himself. It's money that he sees in her, and he wants to consume it by taking it from her. And therefore, he wishes to enter into the yibum. It's good for him. It's not good for me. It's not necessarily good for the family. So Rabbi Chia said to her, "Is he not amenable to you?" And she said, "No, I am certain he is not good for me." So Rabbi Chia accepted her wish. But knowing that this particular yavam was adamant in his desire to marry her, Rabbi Chia said to the yavam, "All right, let her remove your shoe. And in doing so, you will take her in marriage." For he wanted to mislead this man into allowing chalitzah, which would disqualify any subsequent levirate marriage between them. So after the man allowed her to perform chalitzah, Rabbi Chia said to him, "Now she is disqualified for you forever, since you allowed her to perform chalitzah. Although you thought it was an act of marriage, what can I say? We tricked you. You were ignorant. That's why he was able to do it. And now that you have performed chalitzah, she is no longer permitted to marry you. So you have nothing to lose if you permit her to marry others. Therefore, allow her to perform a valid, proper chalitzah." So very interesting. Rabbi Chia is covering his bases here. He's saying they performed some act of chalitzah. Now, because it was lacking intent, the guy thought he was allowing her that he was marrying her by this action. So it's not going to release her to go marry others. But because she did publicly remove his shoe, that's enough of a chalitzah that for sure she can no longer marry him. So since he stands to gain nothing by continuing to refuse to allow her to make a proper chalitzah, he can never marry her again after the shoe removal. He might as well let them repeat the chalitzah, now knowing that it's for the purpose of releasing her to marry others, and that's what he did since he had nothing to gain anyway. Therefore, allow her to perform a valid, proper chalitzah so she will be permitted to others, and by performing a second chalitzah, even Rabbi Yochanan, who disqualified this form of a mistaken chalitzah, would have no problem permitting her to remarry based on the second chalitzah, where the yavam knew what was going on and there was no mistake. And indeed, what is the law, the halacha, on a mistaken chalitzah? If a yavam was deceived, for example, they said to him that the woman will pay him a large sum of money if he allows chalitzah. Even if she does not pay him anything afterward, the chalitzah is valid, in accordance with Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. Even so, she is still obligated to give him what they agreed upon. And this is in accordance with what Abaye said to the woman who performed chalitzah before him. However, in a case where the yavam is obligated by the court to perform chalitzah, and he did not want to, and therefore the court deceived him into doing so by offering the bribe, then she does not owe him anything and need not pay, as in the case that came before Rabbi Chia. Okay. It is told, the daughter of Rav Papa's father-in-law, i.e. his sister-in-law, happened before her yavam for levirate marriage. Yet he was not suitable for her, although he wished to perform yibum. So the case came before Abaye, and Abaye said to the Yavam, let her remove your shoe, and in doing so you will take her in marriage. They deceived this man, like in the previous cases. Rav Papa said to him, I guess to Abaye, does the master, i.e. do you, not accept what Rabbi Yochanan said, that this type of chalitzah does not work at all? And Abaye said to him, but what shall I say to him? So Rav Papa said to Abaye that he should say to him as Rabbi Yochanan himself suggested, let her perform chalitzah on the condition that she will give you 200 dinars. Convince him to allow the chalitzah on the basis that he will profit financially from it. Abaye told the Yavam to do so, and the man agreed, and he let the chalitzah go forward. After he let her perform chalitzah, Abaye said to Rav Papa's sister-in-law, now go give him the money, for you have agreed to give him 200 dinars. Rav Papa said to Abaye on her behalf that a case of, I was fooling you, was what she did to him. She never seriously intended to give him the money when accepting his stipulated condition. And even though the chalitzah is valid, one cannot force her to pay. Now, isn't it taught in a baraisa? One who was running away from prison, and he came upon a ferry. And he said to the ferryman, take a dinar, i.e. he offered to pay an amount much larger than the standard fee for crossing this river on the ferry, and take me across the river. Now, despite the escapee's commitment, it is ruled in the baraisa that the ferryman receives nothing other than his usual rate, as the escapee is legally exempt from paying the higher amount that he had agreed to pay. In other words, you can't become a war profiteer. You can't become a profiteer based on the desperation of an individual where you realize he'll pay anything to get out of this situation. Let's just say that the ferryman is not, undertaking the risk of himself going to jail for helping this prison escapee. He's just saying, this guy's desperate to get across the river. Normally I get a penny. I'm going to charge him $100. In that case, even though the guy says, all right, I'll pay you $100, he doesn't have to pay $100 because the market is a penny for crossing the river, and you can't gouge an individual because of his desperation. This is a case where Torah supersedes the free market, right? And there's only so much price gouging that's going to be possible. That's a huge topic, and we're going to get more into that in kind of the middle of our Daf Yomi journey when we get more into contract law and the law of buying and selling, which is actually fascinating. I mean, when we get into Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, you'll see that there's a reason why many people's Talmud journey begins there. It's so relatable to what still goes on today. But at any rate, this person who's desperate to cross the river, the ferryman, even though the desperate one offered to pay a huge amount of money, he doesn't have to pay it at the end because the ferryman can't price gouge in that way. So, likewise, can we say that this woman who offered to pay this huge amount of money so she can get on with her life and get this chalitzah from this guy, is she really going to be obligated to pay? So apparently one could have said in such a case, I was deceiving you and I never really intended to live up to my side of the agreement. And therefore, it is not an actual debt. I never agreed to become indebted to you for this astronomical sum. I just said what I had to say because you were being unethical when you were asking for that amount of money. So here too, she may say to him, I was fooling you, and she is therefore exempt from paying the 200 dinars. And Abaye heard this, and he agreed. Abaye was amazed at Rav Papa's sharpness, as he was a young man at the time of this incident. Therefore he said to Rav Papa, where is your father? And he said to him, he is in the city. Where is your mother? And he said, in the city. Abaye, who was orphaned in his youth, felt that a large part of Rav Papa's success came because his parents lived in close proximity to him and provided for all his needs, freeing him from any need to get involved in business affairs and enabling him to immerse himself in Torah without distractions. Abaye felt a twinge of jealousy and set his gaze upon them, Rav Papa's parents, in the pain that he did not have similarly supportive parents, and both Rav Papa's father and mother died. What? How are we to make any sense of this story? I mean, I don't think Abaye, maybe he was jealous of Rav Papa and that he was free to pursue Torah study, 20 hours a day because he didn't have to work for a living. But I don't think that he hated him, and certainly that he didn't hate the guy's parents. And he didn't on purpose, like with his sharp gaze and the power of the gaze of a sage, and particularly the curse of a sage, can really damage or even kill a person. But here it's almost like the accidental jealousy directed, he was jealous of Rav Papa, but that, he kind of looked sharply at Rav Papa's parents that caused them to die. It's just really hard to understand that. Maybe it was just a coincidence. I don't know what else to think. And the story just ends there, and perhaps, much of the Talmud is written for this tight audience of the sages themselves, right? The sages talking to other sages. And perhaps this is a bit of a cautionary tale, saying, listen, if you're operating at this very elevated, lofty level of Torah scholarship, you come closer to God, and your words and even your looks acquire great power. And you might accidentally cause great harm just because, you had a flash of anger. So watch it. The sages taught a mistaken chalitzah is valid, while a mistaken bill of divorce is not valid. A coerced chalitzah is invalid, while a coerced bill of divorce is valid. So the Gemara clarifies, what are the circumstances of a coerced bill of divorce? If they force him until he says, I want to give the bill of divorce, then even this type of chalitzah should also be valid. Although he was initially coerced, eventually he acquiesced. And if he did not say by the end of the giving of the bill of divorce, I want to divorce her, then even this type of coerced bill of divorce should also not be acceptable. Now, when they're talking about coercion, what are they saying? Are they saying we're going to torture a man who doesn't want to divorce his wife until he agrees to divorce his wife? Why would the court even get involved to the point that they'd be pressuring him to divorce his wife? They're not going to do that when there's a happy marriage. They're going to do that where a woman is in an abusive situation, a guy who's absent and doesn't care, or a guy who literally beats his wife or something like that. Because remember, under traditional Jewish law, only the husband can give the divorce. There's no one-way divorce where the woman demands it and gets it. So if the guy is in an abusive relationship, abusing his wife, and won't release her to go have be free and go marry someone else who's good for her, this is when the court or a sage might step in and pressure this man, and they might apply tremendous pressure, threatening excommunication, cutting off his business, all kinds of stuff. In super extreme cases, there might even be physical coercion. But at any rate, at a certain point, he has to say, despite all that pressure, yes, fine, I give her the divorce. I want to give her the divorce. If he never says that, he just signs the paper, then that's not going to work as a divorce. Well, how do we compare with the law of chalitzah? So the Gemara answers that this is what the sage said. A mistaken chalitzah, right, where the guy thought he was going to get money, that kind of mistaken chalitzah, that's going to be valid. But a mistaken bill of divorce is never valid. A coerced chalitzah and a coerced bill of divorce are sometimes valid and sometimes not valid. How so? With regard to the one who says after being coerced, I want to give the bill of divorce, it is effective, although he says this as a result of being under compulsion. But with regard to one who does not say, I want to give the bill of divorce, the divorce is not valid. As it is taught in a baraisa, it is said with regard to some offerings, he shall offer it, Leviticus 1:3. And this teaches that they may coerce him to bring the offering that he owes. I might have thought that this means that he brings the offering totally against his will. Therefore, the continuation of that verse states, in accordance with his will. He shall offer it in accordance with his will. How can these two contradictory expositions be reconciled? They coerce him by imposing fines or penalties until he says, I want to. And similarly, you find the same principle with respect to bills of divorce for women, as it is prohibited for anyone other than the husband to write the bill of divorce, but they coerce him until he says, I want to divorce her. And then they write the bill of divorce on his behalf. Rava said that Rav Sachora said that Rav Huna said, judges can allow a man and a woman to conduct chalitzah even if the judges do not recognize the participants. In other words, even if they do not have complete testimony before them that proves that these two people are a yavam and a yavama. Why would they want to perform chalitzah if they were not a yavam and yavama? They must be a yavam and yavama, otherwise why would they do it? If two people wish to perform chalitzah, the judges are not required to check their identities. And likewise, with regard to women making declarations of refusal, meaning a young woman after reaching the majority, after she was betrothed to a adult man while she was still a child, right? This would have happened by her family. Her family betrothed her to this man. And these kinds of things, these very young marriages, which are so unthinkable for us, recall that very often in ancient times, where a typical lifespan could be as little as 40 years, that people were married sort of as soon as they hit puberty. But at any rate, if she was married while she's a minor, she can refuse it. She can say, no, I'm not going to do this. If a young woman, after reaching majority, comes to make a declaration of refusal against her husband, she may do so, even if witnesses do not recognize her and they do not know for sure that she is the wife of the supposed husband. Since she was betrothed to him while still a minor, she can come now and say, I don't want to do it, and the court will listen to her and annul the marriage as if she had never been married. Therefore, in cases where the woman is not identified, although the court may perform chalitzah and refusals, it may not write a document of chalitzah, i.e. a document attesting that chalitzah took place, unless they, the judges, recognize her. They can witness it, and they can say a valid chalitzah happened. But if you want proof of chalitzah, that's only going to work if they recognize who these people are, and or have witnesses to recognize who they are, so that they can write down that so-and-so, we know is so-and-so, perform chalitzah on this day. And witnesses to the act, the witnesses may not write a document of a declaration of refusal, i.e. a document attesting that a refusal took place, unless they, the judges, recognize the woman, as we are concerned about the possibility of a mistake in court. Perhaps a court will not know that such a document is not complete proof that the action was conducted properly, and will consider it as proof that it was the Yevama in this document who removed the shoe, or the wife in this document who made the declaration of refusal. Since the first court can conduct chalitzah and refusals without accepting witnesses attesting to the identities of the involved parties, a second court cannot rely on these attesting documents alone, but must verify the identities before declaring the women eligible for marriage. And Rava himself said the opposite of what he quoted in the name of others. A court may not conduct chalitzah unless they, the judges, recognize the participants. And a court may not convene a declaration of refusal unless they, the judges, recognize the young woman. Therefore, witnesses may write a document of chalitzah, even if they do not recognize the women themselves, as one who witnessed a court conduct chalitzah can be sure that the court already checked the parties' identities thoroughly. And witnesses may write a document of refusal, even if they do not recognize the young woman who has refused, relying on the fact that witnesses must have already attested to their identities. And we need not be concerned about the possibility of a mistake in court, as there is no reason to fear that the first court conducted the case without properly identifying the participants. You can see that the fact that there's a dispute in this, well, what is the actual law, means that, well, we don't know which courts we can trust, that for sure they inspected the identities. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3. Now we're on 106b, which is a short page. We're going to do Mishnah number 4, and it's Gemara, and that will conclude chapter 12. The mitzvah of chalitzah is performed as follows. He and his yavama, right, the yavam and the yavama, come to the court, and the scholars of the court give him advice appropriate for him, whether to enter levirate marriage or perform chalitzah, as it is stated, and the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. They'll actually advise. Now, I think we can probably surmise that by the time they're there before the court, they have a pretty good idea of what they're there to do, either chalitzah or yibum. But Perhaps they're young and foolish, and they didn't think that they could perform Yibum, and it actually would be good for them and for the family. Or they're young and foolish, and they're ready to perform Yibum, but actually they didn't think it through, and a lot of problems could result. Or in fact, they're prohibited to each other, and they don't even need to perform chalitzah because there's a relationship that they didn't consider between them that makes them prohibited. So that's why the elders of the court will advise them. So, if the yavam and the yavama decide to perform chalitzah, she says, my brother-in-law refused to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He did not wish to consummate the levirate marriage. That's Deuteronomy 25:7. And afterwards, he says, I do not wish to take her, from Deuteronomy 25:8. And they would say these statements in the sacred Hebrew language and not in any other language. Either they didn't speak Hebrew, right? The common language was Aramaic, like the way we speak English. And we're not, many of us are not very talented at speaking Hebrew, but a few words, if you just repeat after me, you could do it. And so to make these sacred declarations in front of a court, they made them do it in Hebrew. And they would say these statements in Hebrew. And afterward, the shoe is removed, and then she spits before him, as is written, his Yevamos shall approach him before the elders and remove his shoe from on his foot and spit before him, which indicates that this spittle must be visible to the judges. And she shall respond and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build his brother's house, from Deuteronomy 25:9, right? So it's Deuteronomy 25 verses 7 through 9 that tells us, what are the verses that they need to speak aloud in court. Now, up until this point, the judges would prompt the parties to recite the text that they are required to say. And when Rabbi Hyrcanus once prompted the participants in chalitzah under the Ella tree in the village of Etam, he prompted them to finish reciting the whole Torah passage, after which they established the custom of completing the whole Torah passage. Therefore, they continue with Deuteronomy 25:10, and they say, and his name shall be called in Israel, the house of he who had his shoe removed. And this mitzvah of saying the house of he who had his shoe removed applies to the judges, but not to the students, i.e. the students of the judges and other onlookers who are present. Rabbi Yehuda says it is a mitzvah upon all those present to say he who had his shoe removed. Right? So you can see the solemnity of the occasion. At the end of it, they complete the whole Torah passage, and his name shall be called in Israel, the house of he who had his shoe removed. And who says that? The judges, and some say everyone in the court says it. Now, the Gemara. Rav Yehuda said, this is the correct order for the mitzvah of chalitzah. She recites the sentence beginning with my brother-in-law refused, Deuteronomy 25:7. And afterward, he recites, I do not wish to take her, Deuteronomy 25:8. Then she removes his shoe and spits and recites Deuteronomy 25:9. So shall it be done to the man who does not build his brother's house. Now the Gemara asks, what is Rav Yehuda teaching us? This is already explicit in our Mishna. The Gemara answers, this teaches us that the mitzvah is like this, i.e. this is the proper order. But if one switched the order, we have no problem with it. As even though he did not fulfill the mitzvah properly, ab initio, the chalitzah is still valid, since the order is not indispensable to the outcome of the ceremony. The Gemara comments, this is also taught in a baraisa, whether the removal of the shoe preceded the spitting or whether the spitting preceded the removal of the shoe. What he did is done, and the chalitzah is valid. Abaye said concerning the details of these laws, the one who prompts the yavam and the yavama to read the text for the bill of chalitzah should not prompt her by reciting he did not in Deuteronomy 25:7 by itself and wish to consummate the levirate marriage by itself, because such a way of reading sounds to one who hears only the second phrase like he is saying, my yavam does wish to consummate the marriage. Rather, he should prompt her all at once consecutively. He did not wish to consummate the levirate marriage, which will ensure that the intended meaning is clear. Now, you might have thought, since you want her to repeat after you, that you just say one word or a few words, and then she repeats, and then the next words. But breaking up the phrase like that can confuse onlookers, so he might have to say it slowly, he might have to say it a few times, But he has to say the whole phrase until she can repeat the whole phrase, the whole verse. And the one prompting her should not read to the yavam, I do not, by itself, followed by wish to take her by itself, as again, it sounds to one who is an onlooker and only hears the second phrase like, I do wish to take her. So rather, the one prompting the man should say, I do not wish to take her, and the guy repeats that whole verse. And Rava said it is a mere interruption in the matter, and we have no problem with regard to an interruption in the matter, as it basically is just a pause before taking a breath. I understand where you're coming from, but that's an unnecessary stringency. It is told Rav Ashi found Rav Kahana painstakingly trying to prompt a certain Yevama so that she would recite, he did not wish to consummate the levirate marriage all at once. But the Yevama did not understand, and she was distorting the meaning by not reciting the words properly. So Rav Ashi said to him, does the master not hold that which Rav has said, that the proper pausing during the recitation is not indispensable? And he said to him, although Rava disagreed with Abaye about interruptions in the recitation of I do not wish to take her, Rava concedes concerning the recitation of he did not wish to consummate the levirate marriage, as this recitation is essential and it must be recited properly. And Rav Kahana added that Abaye also said, one who writes a bill of chalitzah must write as follows, we prompted her to recite from my brother-in-law refused until he did not wish to consummate the levirate marriage. And we prompted him to recite from I do not until take her, and we prompted her to recite from so shall until he who had his shoe removed. And Mar Zutra would score lines of parchment and write the whole chalitzah passage on it as a bill of chalitzah. So it would be displayed before the chalitzah participants. And Mar Bar Idi strongly objected to this, but it is unable to be written like this on its own, as the Torah may be written only in a complete state. And it is prohibited to write parts of the Torah when there is no mitzvah to write them separately. And the Gemara comments, even so, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Mar Zutra because there is an aspect of a mitzvah here, as it is being written as part of a bill of chalitzah and not for its own purpose. Abaye said, if the Yevama spat, but the wind seized her saliva and it never landed in front of the face of the Yavam, she did nothing and her actions have no significance. What is the reason for this? We require that she spit before him, in front of him, as is mentioned in the verse. Therefore, if he is tall and she is short and the wind seized it, the requirement of before him is satisfied because the moment the saliva left her mouth, it was in front of him. But if she is tall and he is short, we require that the saliva reach the space in front of his face, and afterward it may go with the wind. So, i.e., if she was taller than him and the saliva was taken by the wind before it reached the height of his face, she hasn't fulfilled her obligation. She needs to spit again. So Rava said, if she ate garlic and spat, or if she ate gargishta clay, i.e. a type of clay once chewed for medicinal purposes, and spat, so she did nothing, and her actions have no halakhic significance, for this is not called spitting. And what is the reason? We require that she shall spit on her own. And this is not satisfied here, for in this case, she spits only on account of another thing that causes a pooling of saliva in her mouth. And Rava said, the judges must see the spittle when it leaves the mouth of the Yevama, and the mere fact that she spat on the ground is insufficient, as it is written, before the elders and spit, indicating that the spitting must take place before the eyes of the judges. I'm very close to done. If you have questions or comments, get them in. It was taught in the Mishna with regard to the verse, and his name shall be called in Israel, the house of he who had his shoe removed. There is a mitzvah upon the judges to recite this, but it is not a requirement for the students or witnesses, the onlookers, the audience in the courtroom. And it is taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda says, once we were sitting before Rabbi Tarfon, and a Yevama came to perform chalitzah. And he said to us, you must all answer, he who had his shoe removed, he who had his shoe removed, he who had his shoe removed, stating that portion of the verse 3 times. And that's where we leave off. That's where chapter 12 ends. That's where a discussion of the particulars of chalitzah ends. And with God's help, tomorrow we'll open chapter 13, which is about that marriage of a minor girl who's married off by her relatives, and then she has that right to refuse that marriage when she comes of age. Okay, Let's see if we've got questions or comments on Mishnah number 3, Mishnah number 3 and 4, and the conclusion of chapter 12. Okay, Nina had to take a call from our daughter, so she missed some of the context, but hopefully it'll make sense. So, Lucy, after the chalitzah, the woman is no longer connected to her deceased husband's family. Does she then receive her ketubah money back? Is that why some yavams did want to perform yibum, even though she did not want it? Right. Well, the yavam that steps in and marries the yavama becomes the immediate heir of his brother's estate. Right? He actually becomes the heir of the estate. Now, he's in a sense a custodian for the oldest child of that estate. But, if he spends all that money before the child grows up, then the child doesn't inherit anything. But in terms of the ketubah, right? I mean, the woman, she is the widow, so she should inherit from that husband. Certainly, she should get the value of the ketubah. Offhand, I'm not sure about the answer to your question. It's a really good question, but for sure, we're going to talk more about that when we get to tractate kesuvos, right? When we're going to be talking about what is a proper ketubah and how does it get enforced. Tom, is this not taking advantage of an ignorant person? For sure, right? When they said that they could lie to this yavam who didn't want to perform chalitzah with his yavama, and the only way to entice him to do it was to offer him a bribe, and then they don't have to pay the bribe. But Abaye said you do have to pay the bribe, so they're not taking advantage. There he got the benefit of his bargain, as it were. But we also saw the rulings that they don't have to pay. Or they even trick him into agreeing where he thinks he's marrying her. Now, that's not going to be a valid chalitzah, but it is going to be enough to ensure that he can never marry her, and then he'll have no choice but to allow the second chalitzah, which will be a valid chalitzah. So they took advantage of that man, for sure. But, from an equity point of view, we don't have to feel too bad about it because this was a guy who was in a kind of rather immoral fashion, in a selfish fashion, not releasing this woman to go live her life. She doesn't want to marry him, so why would we ever want her to be stuck with him? And we certainly don't want her stuck like where she's neither married to him nor free of the levered obligation. So she ends up with no husband, and she's not free to go marry who is good for her. And so that's why they will take advantage of this guy if his ignorance allows that, and we don't have to feel too badly about it. Tom, what if the yavam and the yavama really can't agree on either yibum or chalitzah? Right, well, they can't agree. I mean, chalitzah gotta be the better option. If they can't agree, we don't want them to end up married. And so that would just be further reason, to compel the chalitzah. Ifa, is it good and honorable for a judge and scholar to so lie to the man before him, even if it is to force him to release his yavam? Good. Like, we gotta find some alternative, right? Abaye, in one of those incidents, said, well, what can I do? I've tried everything else. So it seems like tricking the yavam is absolutely last resort, right? So they must try everything else that is much more worthy of a dignified court and of these Torah scholars whose seal is truth. It's only these exigent circumstances where the guy is being a jerk and an idiot and basically imprisoning the woman for the rest of his life that they're going to step in and trick him because he deserves to be tricked. But that's also why in the last Mishnah we read that the proper procedure of chalitzah is that they come before the court and the court advises them, right? And so in that role, you can see that these should be dignified, respected, not just anybody, any layman who can read the verses from the Torah theoretically is qualified to witness the chalitzah. But you want it to be Torah scholars and respected Torah scholars so that there will be some awe of the judges upon the participants in the court and they'll heed their advice. And finally, Bill, the Talmud quotes the Torah extensively. Does that qualify as, for lack of a better word, fair use, and therefore doesn't come under the prohibition against producing a section of the Torah without the rest, unless there's a specific mitzvah? Right, so we saw that there was this law. Now, like, first of all, back then, right, people writing was not the norm, right? It's not that most people were literate. So, you know, if writing was going to happen, if somebody was going to go to the trouble and expense of securing parchment and, you know, writing things out properly, like a bill of divorce, like a bill of chalitzah, you know, the whole mitzvah of bringing the sota to the temple, it was a big deal to write things down. And I didn't recall this prohibition on writing passages from the Torah unless a mitzvah was involved. But I think the point maybe that you're making, Bill, is, well, wait a minute. I mean, we have a mitzvah of Torah study. So if you know, verses from the Torah are going to be written in a context of learning Torah, like the sages are doing in the Talmud, debating law and learning and sharpening their understanding of God's will for us in all situations, well, then there's an inherent mitzvah of learning. And so, you know, shouldn't any kind of Torah verses being written out in the context of Torah debate, of Talmudic debate, of court proceedings automatically be justified as pursuant to a mitzvah? And I would think yes. But on the other hand, we should also remember that the fact that this all ended up in writing was almost a quirk of history, because the oral tradition was meant to be an oral tradition and not written down. And there was tremendous fear when Rebbe wrote down the Mishna around the year 200 that it would lead to all kinds of problems and people who weren't really, you know, worthy to be engaging in these discussions because they didn't have the whole Mishnah memorized and the whole Torah and the whole Tanakh, like the whole Hebrew Bible memorized. Like, all these sages had the entire Bible, every verse in the Bible memorized, and all the Mishnahs memorized. And by the time we get to the Gemara, quite a bit of that memorized as well. But the tradition, even by then, 2,000 years ago, had grown so big that there weren't so many people who were capable of memorizing it all. And then the Roman persecution was wiping out so many of those people, and there was a real fear that that tradition would be lost from Israel. And against that possibility, Rebbe authorized writing it down. Now, when they wrote it down, certainly many verses from the Torah were taken out of context and included. Although we see that so often, because they had it memorized, even when it was written down, they wouldn't write out whole verses. Sometimes I read you a whole verse, but that's partially from the elucidation of Rav Steinsaltz. But the Talmud itself only includes the first few words of the verse. And for these incredibly skilled scholars, they immediately suggest the rest of the verse to them. But the Talmud is actually only writing a few words. And perhaps that prohibition was on whole verses. But I'm not sure where they ended up on that law. Let me see. Do we have a halach on that? Yeah, no, I didn't think they did. They didn't. I don't have a halach on that here. But it's definitely an interesting question about what is permissible to write down and what is not. And even in modern times, where, you know, to write down some verses from the Torah doesn't require a scribe and a quill and the ink and the parchment and everything. And, you know, at our computers, we do it all the time, and we print out stuff all the time. There is the concern of writing verses that include God's name, that you don't just throw that in the trash, right? So whenever we do make printouts that include God's name, so when we're done using them, if they're to be disposed of, you know, we have a box in our house where all that stuff goes in, and then eventually gets taken to the Geniza and it gets buried in a cemetery out of respect to Scripture. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. And a reminder, and we'll post it on the page, there will be no class on Thursday evening. We'll do a double on Friday. But class tomorrow, Wednesday at 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.